probably the best one was a phone call we got about a strange object, very bright object in the sky over the beach. And, after a couple of questions, where in the sky was it? Approximately what hour did you see it? We determined it was Venus, which Venus is the brightest thing in the night sky, with the exception of the moon when it's out. And we told this person on the phone that, yes, it was in fact Venus. And she accused us of being government goons that were covering up an asteroid that was about to hit Earth, and promptly hung up on us. And we stared at each other for a second. We're like, well, that happened. Guess it's the end of the world, and went about our day.
Hello again, astronauts. Today, I'll be chatting with Catherine Hunt, the manager of the Ingram Planetarium. While both managing the planetarium and doing outreach as an impact scientist at the Moorhead Planetarium and Science Center, she has earned a master's in education and is now working on a PhD in educational technology. In her spare time, which she apparently has, she's an artist instructor at Wine and Design. Hey, Catherine, how are you?
Hi, how are you? It's so good to be here today.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. I'm so happy to chat with you. So let's start by talking about your research. I can imagine why the manager of a planetarium would want to study educational technology, but what specifically are you interested in learning?
So when I was working on my undergrad, which was it ended up being an interdisciplinary science degree, I really was focusing a lot of attention on how to increase engagement in science subjects. And around that same time, I got a position, which was at first just a part-time position. Of course, it has since evolved at a planetarium. And I fell head over heels in love for working in the full dome theater. And planetariums are very unique environments now with digital projection. Most people consider them to be very space centric, and that is often still the case. But with digital projection, they're literally VR for your whole room, as a matter of, kind of comparing it to something a little bit more familiar. So I started to investigate how that type of immersive media can increase engagement in the sciences, not just in astronomy, but all sciences as well.
Can you talk a little bit more about your cognitive psychology research?
Yeah. So when we talk about immersive science education, science education is very broad. That could cover biology, chemistry, of course, astronomy is a big one. For me, my very original goal when I was an undergrad was to actually be a science teacher in physical science or earth and space science. And I had planetariums were not even on the radar. In fact, I didn't go into my first dome until I was an adult. I was 26 at a conference when I got my first planetarium experience. So what we teach as content is not necessarily what we're researching. So when we're talking about immersive science education, we're looking at how people cognitively respond to certain teaching methodologies or certain teaching practices, what we call pedagogy. So there's a lot of interdisciplinarity there, a lot of overlap with education, psychology, child development. And people assume that I'm an astronomer by trade, but where I'm researching is actually how the brain is accepting and utilizing the science education that they're receiving in that method.
That makes sense, because I remember when I used to work for the Adler, the people in the theaters department, so the people who were responsible for the dome shows, I think I was the only one with a physics background, and I was just an actor working 1 day a week doing it for funsies. The people who had real jobs were had backgrounds in theater, backgrounds in teaching, backgrounds in graphic design, because that communication is a very different skill. And obviously, like, there were science consultants on all of these shows, but not just anyone with a PhD in astronomy can sit down and write a kids show teaching kids about a few basic tenets of astronomy in a fun and engaging way. That's not a trivial skill set.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Kat, do you have any advice for people who want to study astronomy, or maybe in the future manage planetariums or get into science communication, who are, say, high school, maybe some early college students? What should they kind of think about focusing on?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the interesting things about the planetarium field specifically is it's not necessarily astronomers or astronomy based researchers that get involved. So, for example, as a researcher, I am much more focused on psychology, cognitive psychology specifically, than I am in astronomy. So, you don't necessarily have to focus on astronomy specifically as a research field if you're interested in planetariums or science communication or museums. One thing that is very important with planetarium work is it's such a niche field. In informal education, which means education that happens in museums, science centers, things like that, is a relatively niche field overall as well. A lot of learning that happens in those fields happen on the job. So it's not something you can say, oh, I'm going to go to college to be a museum educator necessarily. You may focus in a science of some sort or education or hybridization of the two. But one of the best ways to get your foot into this type of industry is to volunteer. And museums and science centers always need volunteers. It doesn't matter what time of year or what it is, we always need volunteers. And I've had so many wonderful students come through my planetarium. They've been student presenters and volunteered with us. They've gone on to maybe have summer positions where they were paid during the summer, and then they would go on to do things at their college. Colleges also will often have planetariums, and you can get your foot in the door that way. So there's a lot of different avenues, but it is very hands-on. It's very much a show up at the door, say, I'm interested in this type of work, and get your boots on the ground and your hands dirty with the staff. And that's the best way to get in.
So, what does a planetarium manager do?
Planetarium management positions are very interesting positions in that they're kind of a jack of all trades, and it will look very different depending on the planetarium that you're in. It's also a very small professional community, so we literally pretty much know each other. There's only, comparatively speaking, a handful of planetarians all over the country and the world. But just an example of what many of us do, of course, there's an element of instruction. So a lot of us teach in the planetarium. Some are college based, some are school based, some work in more the museum science center environment like I do. But there's still that element of science instruction. Some planetarians do a lot of production. So there is kind of this awesome blend of art and science. So we're making video content, we're narrating things, and we're making models and animating. So a lot of us do that type of work. And then, of course, we have to deal with the maintenance of our theater. And a lot of times it's one or two people taking care of the whole space. That's audio equipment, visual equipment. We're coding things in our computers. We're cleaning. We're the janitor. It's a very multifaceted position to be in, but it's a lot of fun and it never gets old.
So you balance all of that work you do managing a planetarium with researching for your PhD. I'm married to someone who's just researching for her PhD. I guess my question is, do you sleep?
I actually do sleep. Sleep is very valuable to me. And the really nice thing about working in a planetarium is you don't usually have to get started very early. So that is one professional benefit. And I do live on lots of coffee. I think every single one of us do.
So, what would you say a planetarium does differently than maybe a college class or some sort of online article or a lecture hall in terms of making astronomy and really because it's a dome and we have digital projection, feasibly any STEM subject or really any subject at all accessible to a more broad audience, basically science for people with less of a background in math and science.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is exactly what I kind of hone in on in my research work. Planetariums, for one, they literally immerse you in an experience. So it's one thing to watch a very static, tiny video about a planet or an environment. It's another thing to be transported there. So if you can imagine being transported somewhere, there's a lot more impact, especially for environments that are not necessarily very accessible to our audiences. You know, I may have students and visitors that never can visit Alaska, for example. That would be too difficult for them to reach. So they can't appreciate for themselves the beauty of the Alaskan environment. But I can, for 30 minutes of the day, transport them to that environment and show them in a more sensory way why that environment is so significant and what makes it so special. So it's that sensory rich experience that really amps up the instruction that we do in planetariums. And to be sure, there's different levels of planetarium programming. Some are much more like a lecture, like a science lecture, especially ones that you might see for college students. College classes happen in planetariums all the time, for example. But then you have your more informal education experiences, which are more about the experience than the information, if that makes sense. It gives people a way to connect to the natural world, whatever the topic might be. The better and better we get at planetarium technology, the more and more realistic it becomes. You can compare it to VR glasses. A lot of people have experienced VR glasses. There's a couple of pros to a theater environment versus a virtual reality goggle environment. One, you're with your loved ones, your friends, your family, your classmates. It can be more of a group activity, whereas VR is more stationary or more isolated. VR goggles also are not appropriate for all learners. Little children, for example, it's not really good for them to wear the VR goggles. And you can't wear them for very long, especially if you're not used to them, because you can get headaches and things like that. Whereas a theater is much more comfortable. So there's a lot of benefits to a theater that's in 360 degrees versus VR goggles that brings that to your own person.
I think planetariums are really good at giving people a conceptual understanding because if you want them to just travel through space, you can do that visually
Yeah.
rather than like having maps and numbers. And it's easier to communicate something when people can visualize it.
Exactly. And it's funny you mentioned that conceptual component. There's a great saying that one of my colleagues from Moorhead, her name's Tamara, she says in her workshops, she does science communication workshops. She says, think about what your goal is for your audience. Do you want them to be in the ballpark or do you want them to be on the home plate? She likes to use sports references. And when you're a scientist, an actual scientist, it's very important for you to have the more nitty gritty details for it to be relevant to you. So you want to be on that home plate. But for a lot of our public audiences, we're trying to impart more an appreciation for science. Not everyone will be a scientist at the end of the day. Not everyone can be or wants to be, but everyone has an invested interest in science and the things that we learn from it. So getting them in the ballpark and letting them have that experience is the main goal, as opposed to learning the nitty-gritty details, so to speak.
Yeah, and I definitely, I'm not sure how successful at this I am. I'm still very new and still learning, but I know that for all of my educational videos, my goal is never that people will remember all of like the fun facts I have. Like, I don't want every single member of my audience to like suddenly understand the math of general relativity. I want them to enjoy the pretty pictures, laugh at a few of the jokes, and kind of get their heads sort of around how a black hole works.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's kind of my goal. My goal is always like slightly more understanding, or at least just slightly more interest. I don't think that shooting for home plate, if you're trying to reach a broad audience, is really useful, especially not with my background. I'm in the ballpark on most things anyway. Although I do feel like getting people in the ballpark is really helpful, because you can always look up home plate. Like, you can always go to Google and be like, what was that equation again? But because there's so much misinformation or disinformation or just malicious information out there, it's very important to be in the ballpark so you can identify which sources are right.
Yeah.
Like, otherwise, like, you need to be able to see the forest in order to identify which trees to follow. That, I think, is one of the most important things, at least now as a science communicator, that I want to do. I want to help people see the forest slightly better, so that when somebody points them to a tree that is, you know, upside down and purple and covered in scales, they're like, I don't think
Not a
that's
tree.
a tree. Like, because if you have always been seeing science as like identifying different trees, you're like, oh, this is a new tree. Okay, add it to the list of trees. It's so easy to fall for misinformation if you don't already have kind of a foundational understanding of a field. Like, I am positive that somebody could come up to me, show me a picture of like a weird blob, and tell me it was a famous Hawaiian human-eating fish. And I would have to like phone a friend. I would have to phone my marine biologist friend and be like, hey, is this legit? Because I don't know. Let's talk a little bit more about the Ingram Planetarium itself. I will have a link to the planetarium's website in the description if you want to check it out. Anybody who's in and around the North Carolina area. But what days are you open, and what shows can people expect?
So we are smack dab between two major coastal tourist locations, Wilmington, North Carolina, and the very famous Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. So we are a very seasonal type of planetarium. We do things all year round, but in the off season for us is, like September, Labor Day-ish, all the way through Memorial Day in May. We are usually open the weekends only, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. But then in the summer, we're open 6 to 7 days a week. We have over 60 hours of shows that you can enjoy, featuring a variety of different topics. So we do change it up. I definitely encourage you to keep up with our Facebook or check out our calendar to see what's playing when you're in.
I will put links to the Ingram Planetarium's Facebook and calendar in the description as well.
And one of the really cool things about our model and what makes it doable, and I encourage other planetariums to do this all the time as well. So not just, tooting a horn like that, but just saying that this is a great model and people love it. And Adler does this too, is the live shows, the live programs.
Yep.
And we do a lot completely off the cuff improv. no star show is ever exactly the same, is what I like to say. So that helps a lot, being able to just use my tools to on the fly go out to Pluto or Ceres or talk about Uranus, which is the butt of so many jokes. Doesn't get enough appreciation.
My favorite fun fact is that the planet Uranus used to be named George.
I love that story. Yes, I'm aware
It
of
was
that.
named after King George. And then people were like, really? You named a planet George? that it was changed to Uranus because people were so upset that it was named George. I would give three to four shows a day, and often like one show would be completely different than another because I'd get a show full of elementary school kids and that show would be completely different than the high school kids, and then I'd walk in and it's like, oh, it's mostly adults. Okay, we're gonna have some fun. Are there any upcoming special events that people should be aware of?
Yeah. So one thing that happens in the spring that's really exciting, and it's not an Ingram Planetarium specific event, it's actually something really cool that museums and science centers all over the state of North Carolina do. Every April, we have the North Carolina Science Festival. This is in its, I believe, 11th year. I know we've definitely passed the 10-year mark. And it was started by a very historical planetarium in our state, Moorhead Planetarium is one of the first in the country. And they started this festival as kind of an inspired act when the former President Obama was in office. He wanted us to celebrate science a lot more. He invited science centers all over the country to visit for a science festival on the mall. Moorhead, of course, was in attendance, and they decided to take that energy and that excitement for science and bring it home to North Carolina. And it's just grown. So Ingram Planetarium included, we do events for the Science Festival every single April. It's so much fun. And with 2020, we also have a whole set of virtual activities as part of the festival too. So now people all over the country can enjoy those if they want to.
That's amazing. And I highly recommend, I guess this isn't surprising, the nerd recommending going to do virtual events at different planetariums around the country. But I highly recommend everybody watching go check out their virtual events because that sounds incredible.
Yeah, if you just Google North Carolina Science Festival, a whole calendar of statewide events pops up, and it's the largest celebration of science in the entire country right now, which is really cool.
That's amazing. I used to work at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago before the pandemic hit. Do you have any, I won't call them guest horror stories, but they're basically guest horror stories of just museum guests acting in surprising and unconventional and potentially hazardous ways? Because if so, let's swap stories and just don't say names. It'll be fun.
Well, certainly, especially when you're dealing with some of the topics we deal with, we run a gambit of interesting stories, and there are certainly common experiences. You know, we've all had that one moon landing denier, for example, or someone who is adamant that the world is 5,000 years old. But probably the most interesting thing to ever happen to me, and it was a guest, sort of, but they weren't actually in my theater. It's a little bit of a secondhand story because it happened to the manager that I had before me, but I was working at the time. We got a phone call, and you get phone calls as a planetarium a lot because they see you as an authority on anything space. Whether you are or aren't doesn't matter. You know, people will ask if they have a meteor that they found. People will ask, you know, what this random UFO was in the sky, all kinds of things. Probably the best one was a phone call we got about a strange object, very bright object in the sky over the beach. And, you know, after a couple of questions, you know, where in the sky was it? Approximately what hour did you see it? We determined it was Venus, which Venus is the brightest thing in the night sky, with the exception of the moon when it's out. And we told this person on the phone that yes, it was in fact Venus. And she accused us of being government goons that were covering up an asteroid that was about to hit Earth, and promptly hung up on us. And we stared at each other for a second. We're like, well, that happened. Guess it's the end of the world, and went about our day. So, you know.
That is amazing. I've had my fair share of young Earth creationists, and you'd be surprised just how many are like come there like hoping for a fight. It was a kid's show. Part of the show, the robot explains how the solar system formed over the course of eons. And after the show, a guy comes up to me. And by the way, my character is Jesse. And the year of this show is 2096. We go into the future as part of this show so that we can use like space jump technology. It is a show for children. And this guy comes up to me. He's like, do you really believe all that? And at first, I'm like, dude, there's a kid with you. Of course we're in 2090. Like, I'm like, are you asking if I believe that I'm really in 2096? Because as long as the paycheck clears, I'll say whatever they want. I am an actor. That is my job. And then he like keeps asking follow-ups. And I realize he's asking about the formation of the solar system. And he's like very upset that this show is going against his religion. And I don't figure that out until like 6 questions in. At which point the kid has like all the children have left. So I just look at him like, sir, I'm an actor. I don't know what you want from me. Like, but this is a spaceship in 2096. Like, please leave. I am holding an ice chunk from the rings of Saturn that has not melted in half an hour. What do you expect from me? Like, so do you have any recommendations for parents who want to take their kids to the planetarium?
One thing I do recommend for families, especially with planetariums that have a wide range, shows do vary. A lot of folks, they assume when they come in that we just kind of rehash the same show over and over and over, or something to that extent, or they have an idea that all shows are kid shows because they see it as more of a kid environment. But a lot of the shows that we offer are for older audiences. Not that they're bad or anything, like there's nothing inappropriate. Now, if we talk about the laser shows, that's a different scenario. But space and science shows, none of them are inherently going to be inappropriate, but a lot of kids will not find them as engaging. So it won't be a very enjoyable experience for them necessarily. And if they're not engaged, they're going to be much more apt to act up and make their parents' life more difficult as well. So calling in advance, doing a little bit of research beforehand goes a long way. So kind of what you're looking for. As a good example, even my own family, when they visit planetariums now, they'll call me up and say, hey, will so-and-so sit through this? Speaking about my little 9-year-old nephew, right, who's full of energy. My sister wanted to take him to a show, Birth of Planet Earth. Beautiful show. It's a wonderful show, but not the best show for my nephew, my 9-year-old nephew. I said, oh, it is delightfully and beautifully boring is what I told her. So, just doing your research to see what the environment is going to be like and what's playing will help a lot.
Oh yeah. And I'd say that goes both ways, because at the Adler, we had One World, One Sky, which we all affectionately call the Sesame Street show, because it had a bunch of Sesame Street characters, which we would never recommend a grown adult to see, because you're going to have but it was the under 5 show. Like children under 5 loved that show. There would be screaming, laughter, constant chatter, like, and that was great. We also had like Skywatch Live, which usually involved, what do you think these stars look like? Everybody scream, like, which are fabulous, fabulous, fabulous for kids. But like, we'd have adults leave those shows and be like, you know what? I feel like I was not the target audience. And we do get a lot of people who come to the planetarium, go to what, like, just ask what the most popular show is, go to that, and then are like, oh, I don't think I like planetariums, when really the most popular show is most likely going to be the kids' show. Maybe you would be better served seeing something like Planet Nine, which is more of a science-y show targeted at adults. Whenever you buy tickets to a show or plan your visit, make sure to let the person on the other end know like the makeup of your group in terms of like ages and interests, because then you'll have a much better time.
Exactly. I've made some mistakes along the way, early assumptions, I should say, about what is engaging for the public. So if you're a budding science communicator, or you're a researcher that's wanting to communicate their research to more public audiences, one thing you have to understand is your content is not necessarily going to be interesting because it is. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So really finding relevance to other people, which is going to be highly variable to the person in a lot of time, in a lot of cases, is very important. I learned this very directly in two instances. One, I was working on, and this wasn't planetarium related specifically, but it was science education. I was working on a Lego robotics project in my undergrad, and I had an assumption going in that every kid liked Legos. Bad assumption. Bad assumption. Not every child likes Legos. So connecting them with, in that case, it was more coding and computer technology, but connecting them with that content via Legos for Lego's sake was not the most effective strategy. So I had to learn the hard way. I eventually worked around it. I had to find other ways to connect to certain students. And on the flip side, even scientists can be very different in what their interest is. You know, I had an assumption going to a physics conference, my very first physics conference, every physics person really is interested in space. That is not necessarily the case at all. You have particle physicists in the room, you have engineers, and not all of them are really excited about space. So you have to understand that, one, the fact that some people are not naturally interested is okay, and not to take it personal. You know, we have such an attachment to what we're talking about that sometimes it can feel very personal when people are not interested. But variety is the spice of life. Everyone can't be interested in all the same things, but really finding connection in experiences. You know, space exploration, for example, is not necessarily the most engaging thing on its own. But if you talk to people about what space exploration has done for us, that's where that connection can come from. A great example, the new James Webb Space Telescope, there was technology developed for that project that now is being used by eye doctors to better diagnose ocular disease. People don't necessarily know that automatically that technology has benefited them in some real way like that. But as science communicators, it's our job to bring that to their attention, because that's what's going to give them the investment in that type of research. So when you say, oh, we spent $10 billion on this telescope, what for? But we have all of this fruit from that research that now benefits us. And then it's like, that makes a lot more sense now, why we would do that, why we would make that investment.
Physicists love to talk about how the internet came out of a way for academics at CERN to communicate. the benefit to society is usually not always clear
Hmm.
at first. But I mean, for example, GPS satellites use general relativity corrections to be more accurate. So Einstein's general relativity helps you get to where you're going on Google Maps rather than being a few blocks away. What would you say is the most important thing, not for individual science communicators, but for science communication as a field as a whole to do? Like, what do you think the goal of the field should be? And like, I guess it's top priority in the next few years. What would you say?
I would say that diversity and inclusion is a major priority for science communication moving forward. And I'm not referencing a very superficial kind of diversity and inclusion. Not that that's not valuable and important, but a lot of times when we talk about diversity and inclusion in sciences and in science communication, the way to handle it is, oh, let's put a scientist of a very diverse background on display for a few sessions, and then that's our job is done, right?
Except, what about like closed captioning for people hard of hearing? What about alternate language shows and translations? What about accessible shows for people with sensory sensitivities? What about planetariums that are only barely ADA compliant? Like, there are so many things that are necessary to fostering that diversity and inclusion.
Exactly. And representation is it can't be skin deep, so to speak. It needs to be a more cultural look. Cultures of all over the world have been contributing and active participants in science for a very long time, centuries. Yet we only focus on a very Eurocentric or Americanized experience of science and scientific accomplishment. And also kind of piggybacking on the how to make it relevant for your audiences, what matters to different communities will look very different depending on the community and what their experiences are and what their needs are. So we can't look at inclusion or representation as just a highlight reel, or I've done this one thing, so suddenly I'm very inclusive. We have to really integrate it into our culture. We have to send the message that science is not an American thing, it's not a Eurocentric thing, it's a global thing. Science is a global culture. So I think that's a major priority, not just for planetariums, but museums and science centers and science educators in all parts of that broader field.
Yeah, I think that is so, so important to include diversity like at every stage, like in the content, in who is developing the content, not just who's performing the content, like behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, and throughout the process. I think that's so important because, I mean, if you have only able-bodied, white, wealthier Americans developing shows, well, they're not going to think of things beyond their own experience. And that's not their fault. Like, no human has a universal experience. So if money weren't an object and you could make one big change to improve your planetarium, what would you do?
That is such a difficult question. It's only limited to one thing. I think what I would probably like to see the most for my particular planetarium, and some planetariums do have this available to them already, but I would love to be able to get more into content production than I have the ability to do now. And I'm working on it. I'm actually, I recently got a little bit of funding to start my very first film project, which I'm really, really excited about. But it's very challenging because I'm a production company of one, and
Yeah.
I'm kind of stringing my software and my hardware together. So I would love to be able to have more production capability, specifically in 360-degree videography. So planetarium media, as you might know, is very flush with animated content, a lot of modeling, three-dimensional animation, which is wonderful. I think that that is amazing, the work that is done. But I would love to see more features of our actual environments around us. Some of my favorite films, a couple of them I highly recommend. There's a one that we have the ability to use called A Place Like No Other. It's about Alaska. And then Wayfinders, which is about Polynesian astronomy. You actually, through 360-degree videography, get to go to these places. And it's such a warm and immersive and wonderful experience that I don't see a lot of. And I think because it is a very labor intensive type of production, it's a little bit easier to have a production team sitting in a room animating than to have film crew going all over the world to different locations, right?
Yeah.
So I think if I could make one change with unlimited money, it would be to have that ability.
That sounds awesome, because you could really, with that, I mean, you could expand what your offerings are in a big way. Like you could do an under the sea thing. You could be a a traveling aquarium for a day, or that. I like that a lot. That's brilliant. Thank you so much for talking to me. I'll cut this and hopefully it ends up being coherent. Everybody, if you're still watching, thank you so much for tuning in to my discussion with Kat Hunt. Have a great day, and remember, science is a process. Bye.
Ad Astra, to the stars, to the stars.